It is August 21st and meeting number 26 of the CAWTAC. Thanks as always for your continued participation. Um, just to think back to our last meeting on August 7th, we talked about boundary location factors and parcelization and coordinating with public facility planning. And today we're going to take a little bit of a step back to reflect on some of the discussions we've had thus far. So we're going to start with a big picture review of the Goal 10 process and hear an update on the contextualized housing need and housing type mix compliance pathway. And then we are going to review Oregon Administrative Rules Division 8, kind of the stuff we've already talked about, but we're going to kind of look at it a little more holistically. And that includes housing capacity analysis, land use efficiency measures, development ready land inventories, and fair housing choice. And I just want to pause to say thanks for all the input that you've provided throughout. I know I speak for the DLCD team when I say that your input has been really invaluable, and I can assure you that whether or not you see specific comments reflected in different iterations of the rules or the commentary or future guidance, um, we've considered and taken very seriously the input you've provided. So thank you for that. So that's our agenda for today, and I believe Maddie's gonna kick us off with our racial equity framework focus area of accountability.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all on a lovely August afternoon. We're going to talk a little bit more about the sum total of goal of Division 8 rules, and you've seen quite a voluminous amount of material in your packets. We really appreciate you taking the time to review that. Today's racial equity framework focus area is accountability, thinking about how cities, jurisdictions that are required to do Goal 10 work, consider racial equity opportunities within the HCA, including the buildable land inventory and the development ready land inventory as well, and just holistically how cities take it upon themselves to respond to the housing production target. So we know that there are ways to take racial equity considerations to heart and evaluating those from a wider angle view, in this case, looking at how the pieces and parts fit together, and making sure that we understand, one, the impact that some of those decisions and policy choices will make on a city's ability to meet their housing production target. And then similarly, thinking about how rules ensure that jurisdictions are tracking and otherwise accounting for housing types with certain characteristics and locations that are consistent with their contextualized housing need. So we do want to see how these rules in Division 8 integrate with some of the rules that in the work that you've been looking at around capacity and urbanization interface with Goal 10 priorities and some of the topics that have been covered by other technical advisory committees. So we really appreciate you taking a good look and a clear focus on how some of these draft rules impact accountability and a city's ability to track and produce housing units that it has identified as needed. We also will probably reiterate this question throughout the discussion today as an opportunity to really hone that lens on the equity framework for decision making as we work through our conversation today. Thanks for that, and hand it back to Steve.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Now we'll go to our first item, Goal 10, and Jenna's going to remind us of the Goal 10 process and work. Thanks, Jenna.
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Maddie. And good afternoon, everyone. I just want to reiterate our gratitude for your participation throughout the past year and a half and more. Your feedback has been invaluable up until this point, and hopefully the materials we've shared for this meeting, though there was a lot, I know, hopefully it's helpful for seeing how all the pieces are starting to come together. Up until this point, we've discussed rules pretty much singularly topic by topic, but we haven't really talked about the Division 8 rules as a whole and how they connect to one another. So this graphic here, I know you all have seen it before. This is a review of the Goal 10 process under OHNA. And I think it's helpful to bring it up again to help frame the conversation. In particular, that we'll be focusing on that middle portion there, related to draft amendments for assessing land capacity and development readiness, and also responding to a deficiency through efficiency measures. And in order to get to that point, though, I want to go back to that first column, determine housing need, which is where a jurisdiction would receive their allocated housing need from the state, segmented by income level, which is, as Maddie mentioned, contextualized to determine the needed housing types, characteristics, and locations. Compliance pathways for the contextualized housing need are being developed as part of the Housing Actions Work Group, or HOG scope. And if you all remember from last year, I think it was in July, Mari, who was representing the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee, presented on the draft housing type mix safe harbor that was under consideration at the time. So we are now able to provide an update on how that work has progressed since then, and the current proposal for housing type mix compliance pathway. So I'll invite Ethan to speak about that in just a moment. But really the purpose of sharing part of that work, even though it's not directly part of CalTech's scope, is to make sure everyone is brought along in terms of how these conversations have progressed, and also to better understand how the housing type mix and the contextualized housing need more generally feed into the CalTech work related to the housing capacity analysis, land use efficiency measures, and the development ready land inventory. After Ethan gives his update, we'll then dive into the capacity and urbanization specific rules within Division 8 and discuss some of those key amendments and how the rules function within the larger Goal 10 framework. But before that, I will, Ethan, I'll pass it off to you to give a brief update on the HOG work.
Great. Thanks, Jenna, and good afternoon, everyone. Do a little bit of a kind of a, I don't know, call it a crossover episode a little bit between the Housing Actions Work Group and the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee, because on this point of contextualized housing need, particularly related to housing type mix, there's obviously a connection point there between what cities are doing in terms of determining their needs and types, characteristics, locations, and then taking those actions, doing the further analysis, particularly as it relates to this group in the housing capacity analysis. And so I want to just take a moment now that we have some proposed kind of compliance pathways, one of them being on housing type mix, kind of just share how that's shaping up in your sister advisory committee. In the Housing Actions Work Group, the conversation around contextualizing your housing need under this first kind of section of the Goal 10 planning process. Obviously, cities, like Jenna mentioned, are receiving a housing production target and needed housing allocation from the state. They are then taking those numbers and bringing that down into their local context through this contextualized housing need assessment. One of the results of the contextualized housing need you could think of is really kind of that first chapter of what the housing capacity analysis seeks to respond to. of, all right, we're taking our housing production target and needed housing allocation and saying, like, how does this actually manifest itself in our local government, given all of the context that we know about our jurisdiction. In crafting that approach, the contextualized housing need, cities in the 2024 portion of the rulemaking, cities and other folks who are involved in that process were kind of asking the question of, like, how do we do this? Is there any support or any guidance or any direction? How do we know that we've sufficiently kind of contextualize our housing need, and how do we know that assessment is full and true and is meeting the expectations and obligations of the state? And so part of that response was, well, maybe the state can provide some compliance pathways, whether it's safe harbors, whether it's requirements, whether it's minimum standards, whatever it is, to show in more of a rule standpoint what that kind of sufficiency looks like. So in the context of housing type mix, just last week and in the conversation yesterday with the Housing Actions Work Group, we kind of overviewed that proposed compliance pathway for unit housing type mix, which is a rebuttable presumption, which basically in less technical terms basically means setting the bar at a point and saying a city or jurisdiction can use this bar to move forward in their process, or has the opportunity to rebut that and provide their own assessment, their own analysis that says, state, we see the line in the sand that you're drawing, or the bar that you're setting, but we would like to use a different approach or use different analysis to get to substantially the same ends of that approach. And for housing type mix, kind of, I don't have a slide, and that would have probably been better in hindsight, but I'll kind of articulate what that housing type mix is. So essentially, in the estimation or the translation in contextualized housing need, the local government would demonstrate that they are planning for 40% of their housing production target and or allocated housing need to be identified as multi-unit housing, and 20% of that housing production target and allocated housing need to be middle housing. So at the end of that contextualized housing need assessment, those numbers, a city could say, all right, we are moving forward and we're planning to achieve those 40 and 20% metrics, and we're going to move into our action selection process or our housing capacity assessment process with that information in tow, and that's going to be the type of housing mixes that we're planning for going forward. Or alternatively, a local government can say, based on analysis that we're going to provide to the state, we're going to use a different mix number, but it should be at least meeting the spirit, intent, the approach, the end result of that's equivalent to that 40-20% mix for multi-unit and middle housing. So I just wanted to kind of share that for you all today, and also kind of highlight the importance of what the contextualized housing need actually means in what cities do. This is not a requirement in terms of only that percentage of housing can be built in the jurisdiction. It is setting the marker in terms of what local governments are planning towards, the future that they are planning towards, which then, of course, obviously impacts the actions and the response that cities have to try to accomplish or facilitate that future. So I think with that overview, I'll hand this back to you, Jenna, or entertain any questions that folks have.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions for clarification of the information Ethan shared, now would be the time. Damien.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. Just a, pardon me, let me lower my hand. So a question on the 40 and 20 percentages, is that intended to, or does that recognize that for a lot of cities, you are our OHNA housing projection is going to probably include more units toward the lower part of the AMI scale, like 0 to 30, 30 to 60.
Mhm.
Is my question clear enough?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's it's informing the metrics, and it's informing the percentages, because what we know is those housing production targets, those needed housing allocations, are going to really ask jurisdictions to, meet that need in, let's call it 80% AMI and less generally. One of those approaches is to think about sliding the scales in terms of those other housing types to try to meet some of that demand, obviously, or some of that need. Obviously, there's going to be many other factors at play just outside of housing type mix that cities and local governments can take to try to meet that need. But that is one approach here that's informing the proposal.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Al, and then Mary Kyle.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So I have quite a lot probably to say about this, which I'll probably put in writing, but I just wanted to raise a couple of issues. One is I think there is a difference between a presumption and a safe harbor, and I will talk about that in more detail in a memo. And I'm wondering where the department feels it has the ability to prescribe or award capacity projection without basing it on the facts that it's required, the local jurisdictions are required to assess under the needed housing statute for assessing whether something is in a BLI and then what its capacity is. So I'm just wondering at this point whether the safe harbor approach really applies in this context, and whether the presumption, uh, uh, whether a safe harbor would set a bar of any sort, as opposed to simply being something out there that might be a free pass or might not. Anyway, I'll talk more about that uh, as I study it more closely. A lot of stuff landed on our desk this week.
Yes, it did, absolutely. And I think, just in response to that, one of the key um, functional approaches with a rebuttable presumption is that it sets an expectation in a way that doesn't also set a requirement. And it formalizes that expectation that these are the kinds of things that cities should be thinking about in terms of, like, what is the need? What is that translation from a housing production target or needed housing allocation into something that local governments can actually do something with, right? And one of those tools that local governments can actually do something with is to plan for a certain mix of housing. So really kind of leaning into that approach and saying, this is one of the tools, we should be sure to utilize that tool in particular.
All right, we'll take these last two questions, then we'll move on to the rest of our agenda. Mary Kyle?
Thank you. I appreciate that this tool is an attempt to find that happy spot between regulations and flexibility, or certainty and flexibility. So I appreciate that. I raised this question yesterday when this came up in the HOG, and then I had to get off to go to another meeting, and I don't know if it was fully answered. And today I also have to get off to get to another meeting. So let's try it again. I like this attempt, with the percentages and such of rebuttable presumption or safe harbor, but it doesn't take into account issues of location and how that relates to equity, fair housing, et cetera. And so maybe there's something else that's running parallel to this that addresses that. And there were a lot of pages. And so I totally could have missed how those are connected.
It's not explicitly connected in terms of the compliance pathway approach, although the directive in the contextualized housing need for local governments, and this is in the rules that were adopted in 2024, is that local governments are articulating through their contextualized housing need the housing types, characteristics, and locations, it's an and statement, that are needed in their jurisdiction. So whether or not there's a compliance pathway for location, that is still an obligation for local governments. There's just no like state identified pathway by which to conduct that analysis. There's also tools that we're providing, adding tools to the toolbox for local governments to make that process easier or somewhat straightforward, or at least provide some resources and opportunities for them to do that work on their own behalf, that are, again, not used as like a requirement or anything close to that, but is provided as guidance or like resources in.
So if a city chose to use wherever the percentages land as a safe harbor, rebuttable presumption, whatever, they would still have to show, well, our contextualized housing need has shown these things about our city in terms of the location. Right. And that's so right. Doing this upzoning or rezoning in appropriate locations.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the actions in response is the work of the housing capacity analysis and the housing production strategy, but a conclusion, a result, a required result of the contextualized housing need is that consideration of location and the patterns in the jurisdiction that are present.
Thank you.
Brock.
Yeah, so a little bit getting into the tangent that came up in Mary Kyle's question, but with the rule in 200 subsection 3, where it's talking about applying the middle housing and multifamily model codes on 50% of buildable residential land that allow and 100% of development ready land that allows multi-unit housing. There is additionally a couple of rules in the 400 section that are going to have a nexus with that. One of them being 410.6D, and another one being 415.1C. And so the reason that I bring those up in this meeting is that, one, I brought them up at the Hog yesterday, and it was mentioned that this was a more appropriate venue for it. So what I'll ask is this. So with 410, application of a model code doesn't trigger a requirement for a city to update an analysis under goals related to housing, transportation, or public facilities. Right. It does not include urbanization. So if a city applies that model code for multi-unit housing to all of its development ready land, does that change the math in a housing capacity analysis? So because it would be allowed there, right? Because it's not zoned for, but it's zoned to allow. And you can apply a more dense model code than what the zoning allows. Does that impact your HCA math? In other words, if something was presumably about 10 units an acre previously, is it now going to have to be counted as 20 if it's development ready because it has that multi-unit housing model code applied to it directly, regardless of whether that zoning intensity was allowed previously?
It's a good question. Without diving deeper into the answer to that, my answer right now is this, is that that it may be the case that, well, no, okay. So I was going to say that local governments would have to identify their Goal 14 findings as part of that, but that's, like you just said, is not the case in the application of the model code. So where it would be identified is at the time the city does the next housing capacity analysis, estimating, their achieved and zoned capacity, that's where it would factor in. Sitting here right now, that's how I'm envisioning that would work.
So even if the zoning doesn't change, the application of that model code would change the housing capacity assumption for that land.
Right, because it would be the functional, operative development standards in that zone.
Okay. I think I've made it clear that I believe this is a problem. I would not be surprised if many others did as well, particularly considering that if you're applying that multifamily model, multi-unit model code to 100% of development-ready lands, that means that all of your development-ready lands are going to be assumed at 20 units an acre, every single one of them. So I just want to make that clear to everybody so that we can have that discussion, because that is a huge change in what we've been thinking about, how the way these rules are going to impact our housing capacity analysis. That is a huge change. I'll stop there for now, but I do expect that there'll be additional discussion about this.
Thank you, Brock, and thank you, Ethan. We're going to move on to our discussion of Division 8 and kind of 4. You can see discrete components of that and reflect on all of the important work that we've done to get us here. Jenna and Maddie are going to lead us through this, and since there is plenty of content within those 4, I'm going to keep an eye on the clock to make sure we don't run out of time. So, Jenna?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so Maddie and I will walk through some of the key draft rule amendments included as part of your CalTAC packet in Division 8. And we've talked about all of these topics before, but the conversation we hope to have today is focused on thinking about Division 8 holistically and how each piece fits into the larger Goal 10 framework. And something that we thought about when we were first putting these rules together, for example, was that a lot of the housing capacity analysis and BLI rules were not really well organized, with some of the rules being in Division 8, some of them being in Division 24. So we've really tried to reorganize and consolidate where possible to make the rules just generally easier to use. So a jurisdiction doesn't have to like keep flipping back and forth between 2 divisions just to accomplish a BLI. So you'll see those types of structural changes reflected in the rules. And we'll summarize some of the major changes for these topics, though, it won't cover everything. And we will pause after each of these topics for discussion. Some questions to keep in mind as we are going through are, 1, do the draft rule amendments for these topics implement the legislative direction to create clarity and certainty? Do they implement the racial equity framework, in particular, our focus area for today, which is accountability? Are they written in a way that is clear and effective in terms of how they get applied? And are there any omissions or places where more cohesion is needed? So with that, I think we can get into it on the next slide. Yes, thanks. Starting with the housing capacity analysis. As we talked about, this utilizes information in the contextualized housing need related to housing types to inform what the residential land needs are over a 20-year period. And then comparing that with the buildable land inventory or the 20-year land capacity to evaluate whether there is enough capacity to meet the need. If not, a local government will need to take action to respond to the deficiency. Next slide. So a lot of the draft rule amendments you've seen before, especially in regard to definitions, though there has been some wordsmithing changes since then to make the language in general more clear. The biggest change to the draft rules is the addition of the housing capacity analysis rule in section 0100. And this is largely, again, an organizational or structural change where we aim to put all housing capacity analysis related rules in one place, including bringing over some rules that were previously in Division 24. So this rule clarifies what needs to be in a housing capacity analysis, including how information from a contextualized housing need plugs in. The requirement that jurisdictions coordinate with public entities to inventory publicly owned land was pulled out of the definition of buildable land, where we thought it's likely to get lost, and put into these more substantive rules. And we've also moved the rules, as I mentioned, related to inventorying partially vacant land. And I'll get into greater detail on that in the next 2 slides. So I think we can go to the next one. And so this partially vacant land safe harbor is a newly proposed addition from the last draft. And this safe harbor is for local governments over 25,000. There is an existing safe harbor for smaller cities that was also carried over from Division 24. And this safe harbor applies to lots in low density plan designations, around 10 dwelling units an acre. For lots smaller than a half acre, the infill potential can be determined by subtracting a quarter acre for an existing dwelling unit. Lots less than a quarter acre may be assumed to be developed, and lots 2 times the minimum lot size are considered buildable. Specific feedback on this draft safe harbor would especially be helpful for today, including whether or not it's clear, or any other comments. Next slide, please. And then the last piece I'll touch on before we pause for discussion is the land market supply factor, which serves as an additional option to the safe harbor to reduce assumed capacity of partially vacant land. This language on this slide isn't new to you all, but we have previously discussed some key policy choices in terms of how a land market supply factor should be applied, whether the safe harbor should be increased above 10%. So just highlighting again here in case there are any additional perspectives that we hadn't heard yet. And with that, I think I can hand it back to Steve for discussion.
Great, thanks, Jenna. So a recap of items we've seen before, and then a few new items. Does anyone have any questions or comments, especially about the new the items you're seeing for the first time today? Brock.
Yeah, one clarifying question. So when we're looking at 104, so that would be the capacity assumption for cities under 25,000. It's that or cities in a metropolitan service district, and it says as defined in ORS 197015 subsection 13. Right now I'm looking at the statutes on the legislative website, and that is a definition of local government, not a definition of a metropolitan service district, which, unless I'm missing it here, no, is not actually even defined in that section at all, unless it's like somewhere hidden under another one that I'm just not seeing. So can you provide a little clarity as to what that is intended to reference?
Pause, but
Yeah, I might. Yeah, let me take a greater look at that, Brock, and get back to you. But yeah, yeah, we can take a look.
Okay. And then for 5, instead of creating a new one that is more difficult to use for larger cities, why are we not just taking out the population size in the metropolitan service district as a condition of being able to use that safe harbor?
so why create a separate safe harbor for larger cities rather than just extend the current small city safe harbor to all cities?
Mhm.
Was that discussed, Jenna or Maddie?
Well, I guess that's a question for the large cities in the room. Would you like to just use the existing safe harbor, or is a specific safe harbor for large cities needed?
And then, well, large cities are thinking about their response there. So for the 10% safe harbor for partially vacant land, one, I still have a problem that it's only applied to partially vacant land. We've seen with Washington that they count this for their vacant land as well. Two, I am still pretty disturbed that for the partially vacant land, the safe harbor land supply factor is 10% when we've seen that the average is closer to, I think, 22 or 23. So again, while yes, this does give a little bit of flexibility for cities to discount some capacity, it is not all the phantom capacity that we know exists. Um, Washington allows up to 55% for some of their partially vacant land. Um, and even for their vacant land, they never go below, I think, about 10. I'll have to pull up. Oh, wait, actually, I have it right here. 7 to 37% for partially vacant land. So that is an average of 22%. Uh, or sorry, that's for vacant land. 7 to 37 for vacant land. 9 to 55 for partially vacant land. So that would be an average of 32. So I'm wondering why we're still continuing to keep that at 10% when no one in this room has stated differently that they believe that the other 90% are going to develop to capacity.
Thanks, Brock. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jenna, just a reminder that is a safe harbor number, and cities would be able to do the work to show something beyond the safe harbor. Is that correct? I see some nodding.
Right, yeah, they would need to show their work.
So just a clarification there. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I don't have a thought yet on using the small city safe harbor. I'm still kind of mulling that over. So, but I do have a few comments on the new 5 that we were looking at, which I was glad to see in the rules. I think it's intended to provide kind of a similar safe harbor where we can look at lots that are already developed and try to then have a safe harbor for estimating their capacity. 5C of that section, I think could be more clear because I had to read it a few times and I think I know what it's getting at, but without trying to say so and embarrass myself, I'll stop there. I do appreciate 5A and B because I think it provides cities that opportunity to kind of recognize that there are going to be parcels that it would be better to treat them as developed and keep it easy. And then maybe focus a little bit more attention on some of those larger parcels that have more development capacity. So we're getting at something more, hopefully more realistic. So will there be an opportunity to provide some follow-up comments on a Miro board or kind of just email them to the team after we're done?
Thanks for that question, Damien. I was just going to mention, and we'll reiterate at the end, that I think at this point, email is the preferred, for today's topics, email is the preferred way to communicate additional thoughts. So
Okay.
everyone, yeah, thanks for that question.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Al.
Thanks, Steve. So the question I had was it's kind of related to the discount and the zone to allow. By zone to allow, does that mean that if you've got a mixed use parcel vacant and a developed, and another parcel that is just residential, that if they both have certain capacity, you're going to assume that they have that zone capacity, they're going to build out fully without some competition from the mixed use. And that gets to the discount question. Does the 10% discount mean that you're presuming that land will all develop at least 90% of its zoned to allow capacity over the applicable 20-year period? That's the more important question.
Jenna? Yeah.
And we can do that with the emails too. So.
Oh yeah, email comments are absolutely welcome. In terms of the definition of zone to allow, that's currently in Division 24. And let me pull up the definition, just so we're all looking at the same language. Zone to allow means that the comprehensive plan and implementing zoning allows the specific housing types and density or densities under clear and objective standards or other requirements specified in ORS 197 dot 307. So it would be land that allows residential use under clear and objective standards. And Beth and Ethan, I see your hands, so I'll let you chime in too.
You can fight over who gets to go first. Go
I'll
ahead, Beth.
go first very briefly. So the issue is that it's uncommon for over lots of different lots for lots to develop at 100% of the zoning. So in other words, if you zone to allow 20 dwelling units an acre, and you look at 100 acres of land in that zone, you're not going to see an average density of 20 dwelling units an acre. You'll see an average density of something less than that because you've got things like flag lots where, you know, you can't fully build it out, and weird shaped lots, and people have just chosen not to build at that high a density. And so Al, I think the question you're asking is there an implied assumption that development will happen at 90% of maximum density? And if that's your question, that's not something I've thought of or heard, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think the approach now under current rules is that the assumption is that those partially vacant lots will build out to, you know, that's why they're counted as part of the buildable lands inventory. That's why their capacity is considered in the way that it is under current administrative rules. This safe harbor says, in recognition that there are those instances where partially vacant, because of the underlying economics of redevelopment in that way, there are likely not going to be all of those partially vacant lots developed over the course of the planning horizon. And therefore, cities can take a discount, this land market supply factor discount of that capacity in recognition of that economic reality.
Can
Okay, I'll just say I have never seen anything in any case law or in the statutes that assumes that because something is in the BLI that it's expected to build out over that period. That is a question for a local jurisdiction to make a determination on based upon what the record shows. And in some cases, they'll have people come in and they'll say, hey, this isn't going to build out because, and then the local government makes a decision on that, and that gets reviewed. I've never seen it held otherwise.
Can I revise what I said because I misunderstood your question a little bit, Al? In a buildable lands inventory now, if you said we've got 100 acres of buildable land in such and such zone, what this is saying is you can use a land market 100 acres of partially vacant buildable land in such and such zone. You can use the market supply to say, instead of assuming that 100 acres will build out, that 90% of that 100 acres, or, you know, 90 acres in that case would build out. So it's a way to look at your buildable lands inventory and acknowledge less development is going to happen. You know, less of that land is going to develop, I think is a better way of saying it, than one might assume because it's partially vacant. So it's a different way of making that argument that some of this land won't develop.
Right. So what I would say is the statute basically says it's up to the local jurisdiction to show that it has the capacity. And part of showing capacity is to show it's reasonably likely that a particular piece of land, vacant or otherwise, is likely to build out at a certain yield over the next 20 years. If it's 30 years out, then it's not going to count. And so And is this also saying that you're not going to allow any market factor consideration for fully vacant land? Is that what the statute says? Is that authorized?
The statute does not speak to that specifically, but the discount is, as it's proposed here, only speaks to a discount in partially vacant contexts.
Right. Okay. And as I think I said in my memo, I've never seen the term discount until this rulemaking process, and I don't think that's the way it works. So you're
Thanks,
setting yourself up.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Ethan.
Sorry, yeah. I think a safe harbor provided by the state in terms of how to conduct that calculation is one of the ways in which local governments can rely upon in making that assessment of what is the capacity of partially vacant land. And that's the mechanism that's used here.
Okay. Brock, and then we need to move on to our next topic.
Yeah, one thing, just a quick flag, the citation and the definition for zone to allow in the updated Division 24 packet that we got yesterday afternoon. That should be 197A 400. It was a change that was made in one of the previous packets, but it looks like it just didn't carry over. Another thing I was going to say, so when you're doing a housing capacity analysis under subsection 6 of that rule, 6A says that you are calculating the capacity there for the purpose of meeting your goal 10 consistent with 197A 355. 197A 350 only applies to capital M metro. It doesn't apply to all metropolitan service districts, which is who's required to comply with CFEC and adopt climate-friendly areas. So there is an inconsistency there. And additionally, as long as we're talking about this rule, if we're looking under 7, considering that a lot of the rules that have been developed through this rulemaking are going to focus on including, if you get sent into an audit, barriers to developing housing in climate-friendly areas. It seems that if the department is confident that the climate-friendly area rules are going to actually cause the types of development that they are intended to, that we would not need to say half of the number of your expansion area would need to be in a new CFA. We could say 30%. So I think that should be reduced. And while that is a comment that I made during the CFEC rulemaking, I'll make it again here since we're addressing the rule again.
Thanks, Brock. All right, Jenna and Maddie.
Find my unmute button. I've got a lot of screens open. Hi, everyone. Our next topic we're moving into is land use efficiency measures. And just to re-ground everyone in land use efficiency measures, and we're talking about when after a city does their housing capacity analysis and determines either that they have sufficient amount of land, in which case they need not take additional actions, or they may take land use efficiency measures now, in this case, in the context of their contextualized housing needs. So again, getting back to the characteristics, types, and locations that housing may be needed or declared to be needed in the contextualized housing need may merit land use efficiency measures, which is a new or different step that land use efficiency measures take on in the work that we're looking at here in Division 8. If a community finds that they have insufficient amounts of land, then they must adopt measures to accommodate needed housing, and that's 197A 270. Just to bring us back to that graphic from the beginning, you'll see land use efficiency measures is defined in the context of this work. You will have remembered that from the work that we did several months ago, and you'll also see that we've worked to wordsmith or update the draft definition of land use efficiency measure, hopefully to reflect some of the feedback that we got from you in both May and July of this year. We're hoping to clarify the function of a land use efficiency measure, that a land use efficiency measure specifically requires it's a land use decision, it requires findings and quantifiable validation if a city wishes to exceed some of the criteria related to efficiency measures. We've also developed in your packet, you'll remember there's a safe harbor opportunity to give cities more clarity and certainty when they move into their urbanization, their urban growth boundary work. And we've also proposed some timing changes to the ways that cities address or adopt land use efficiency measures. Trying to think if there will be some other elements that we'll raise when we come to the point of developing guidance on this topic, but we've had much debate over the decision-making tree of land use efficiency measures as a subset to the sum total of housing production strategy actions, in which of those elements ought to fit within the definition of a land use efficiency measure as defined here or proposed to be defined in Division 8. I won't belabor that too much because I feel like we've had quite a bit of robust discussion on that topic, and move directly into the next item. We can have this conversation now, Steve, and then we'll move into development readiness as we work through the Division 8.
Sounds good. So we will take questions and comments on land use efficiency measures. I'm going to start with Heather.
Thanks, Steve. So yes, we did talk about this last time. I think it was the definition of land use efficiency measures, and we talked about where do financial incentives fit in, because as the proposed definition is again proposed, financial incentives that might create more housing through redevelopment than we would have otherwise seen, like the multiple unit property tax exemption, for example, that would not be counted as an efficiency measure based on this, even though it would be increasing housing units beyond what you would see without the incentive. So in my mind, I think of it as an efficiency measure, and the city has adopted those things as efficiency measures previously. We met with staff to talk about this issue specifically, and some, but not all of staff, pointed us to the ORS 197 A355, which is talking about the things that the components, the data that you need to take into account during your housing capacity analysis. And one of them is 5AC, market factors that may substantially impact future urban residential development, and that might be the place where a city could say, hey, we're adopting MUPD, we're expanding MUPD, or something like that. And so we expect that while we are meeting, we're showing you the data potentially from A of that section, the number density average of residential development that has actually occurred. We're adopting these financial incentives, which our market analysis shows that this is a market factor that would see more, that would change what we've seen in the past. So it's like an efficiency measure without calling it a land use efficiency measure. And I think I said this last time, I whatever we call it, I don't care. I just want to be able to make it really clear that we are able to count that as actions the city has taken to facilitate more housing than we would otherwise see without those actions. So I want to be able to use it in the math. So there's nothing proposed right now to make that more clear. And I'm not sure exactly where that would happen. I'd be curious to know if other folks think that one piece in the ORS is enough and that we don't need anything else in the rules to make that clear. Because again, previously cities have been adopting those things as efficiency measures. And so this would be a change to say, no, that's not an efficiency measure. This is where you should address it. So again, I'm fine with that, but I just want it to be uber clear that that we can count those in our math about how we're meeting our need. So that's kind of my big thing on efficiency measures. Thank you. And again, appreciate staff meeting with us on this. I know that this is a sticky item, but I think it affects everybody and it really affects the goals of seeing more redevelopment happen. So thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Maddie, do you have anything to say before we move on to more questions or comments? Or
No, Heather, thanks for reiterating that perspective and also for summarizing the conversation for the benefit of everyone in the room related to that. Yes, it is a change. We are trying to discern a fairly bright line between those land use measures that are part of land use decisions that have findings and quantifiable validation of or quantifiably reduce the land need impacts. And you do make a very good argument there with market factors that that may affect future redevelopment opportunities in certain areas. We've just looked at we looked at that type of approach as in the paradigm of the housing production strategy as a way to encourage and incent certain types of development that would not otherwise have occurred in that area if not for the incentive or financial opportunity that you mentioned. So greatly appreciate that discernment and also just highlight some reasoning why we've tried to make that distinction.
thanks, Maddie. Ted?
I can be quick. I agree with Heather. I think the financial tools are some of the most important tools that we have for encouraging redevelopment and infill, particularly in light of the discussion we just had about market factors. If we think that the market is not going to build to full zone density, then I think limiting land use efficiency measures to say upzoning doesn't make a lot of sense. What would you hope to achieve by upzoning if you don't think the market is going to get to that lower amount? So I'd really like this to somehow recognize those financial tools, some of which Heather mentioned.
Thank you, Ted. Damien?
Thanks, Dave. I may not be so quick, but I'll try to be as quick as possible. So on the new definition of land use efficiency measure, I think I have a three-part question. One is the use of the term action, if that is intended to refer to the new definition for action that's in 008-00052, which I think it does, but just wanted to confirm that. Second is the proposed language of consistent with ORS 197-610. And my question is if that citation is too limiting, it needs to be expanded to recognize those efficiency measures that may be adopted as part of a decision on an urban growth boundary amendment that would be submitted under 197-626. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Maddie, do you have any?
And I can at least answer the first one, and I might need to phone some friends on the second too. But first one, yes, does refer to housing production strategy actions that you refer to. I believe that was 0052. As far as the reference to 610 and the subsequent question, I'm wondering if Jenna or Ethan, you have those handy that you could confirm or clarify.
I should acknowledge that for some of these items we're talking about today, Cotton is the lead person, and she's not able to be here today. So in the event that we don't have answers at our fingertips, we'll certainly get back to the group with those.
Yeah,
But
thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, Steve.
Jenna or Ethan, did you have anything to add right now? No. Okay.
We'll
We will
get back to you, Damien. Thank you.
Brock.
Yeah. So one, considering the number of times that this has been raised, not even initially by me, but I agree with the other stakeholders that have raised it. Al, I think you were one. I think Clackamas County was another. The use of the terms demonstrate and are estimated to result in. Uh, has the department actually reviewed the language that I submitted more than a month ago to try to fix this? Because I really, honest to God, did my best to make sure that it didn't change the function of the rule, didn't change the intent of the rule. But this is now, I think, the fourth time that we've seen an iteration of this since I've sent that in. And when I've asked about it in the past, I've just heard, "Oh, we're looking at things." But I went onto the DLCD website earlier this week, and when it was uploaded online, it wasn't even uploaded in a way that it's viewable to anybody from this TAC to look at. And I know that you've asked us not to send things directly to the entire TAC or RAC, and so I haven't, hoping that that was how that's there. I also noticed that for another set of comments that we submitted, but I'm just wondering, has anybody actually looked at that suggested language? And if so, what is the reason that it has not been addressed? Not that it has to be the way that I wrote it, but given the number of stakeholders that have raised this concern, why has it not been addressed?
Ethan.
So yeah, I think when we're talking about the actions that cities are taking under ORS 187A 270, sorry, my dog, the previous statutory framework was local governments would take all of the actions because there was a housing capacity analysis, and the measures to accommodate were just all of the measures, all of the things. Now, with the introduction of the housing production strategy as a separate process that has its own set of requirements, and is seeking to address a broader element of need, not just number of acres or the capacity of the acres within a jurisdiction, but rather all of those other tools in the toolbox, the financial incentives, the educational elements, all of those things. There's a place for those to be considered, and in fact, in a lot of ways, must be considered, because if it's identified in the contextualized housing need, they need to be addressed.
Right. So is the difference in the rule language for
I can't read that. I'm sorry.
subsection 150 subsection 2. As a safe harbor for residential land use efficiency, local government must demonstrate that proposed measures once adopted are estimated to result in at least 20%. We've had multiple stakeholders raise concern about the inconsistency between those two terms. And so I'm wondering if this has been looked at. That's not to speak to the fact that when we define actions in Rule 5, as Damien just brought up, it says may include land use efficiency measures, while everywhere else in the rules it's a must.
I'm going to just mention again that I know Cotton has been the lead on this, Brock. So this might be one where you and Cotton connect on phone when she's available again, because I don't know if anyone else is at the moment ready to respond. Because I'm sure she would be the one to field and review your comments.
Okay, I can follow up with her on that one. One other piece that's direct to the question that was asked, how does this implement legislative direction? When we're looking at House Bill 2001, Section 9, subsection 2, paragraph B, and adopting rules under the section, the commission shall prioritize providing greater clarity and certainty in the adoption and acknowledgement of housing capacity analyses, UGB expansions, exchanges, or urban reserves. So I see in this rule how we have potentially, provided greater clarity and certainty in what goes into a housing capacity analysis. Aside from a safe harbor, which is optional, I don't think these rules provide any clarity and certainty into what is sufficient in terms of how much land use efficiency measures you need to put into place in order for your HC or your HPS not to be remanded, or in order for your UGB expansion to be approved as adopted locally, as opposed to being remanded to include additional efficiency measures. I think that's a really key component of these rules, and it's something that the commission shall prioritize, but I don't see anything in these rules that speak to what a reasonable assumed threshold is for a local government to adopt in terms of land use efficiency measures in order to make sure that they are safe in doing so. There's a safe harbor, getting 20%. I have a feeling that that's going to be a pretty big lift to achieve, right? So if you're not taking that safe harbor, what's the floor?
Thanks, Brock. I'll just say, I don't know if Maddie or Ethan have comments, but I know, this has been discussed a lot, and I just want to remind everyone that, there's rules, and then there's also going to be guidance that's going to come as well. And some things, the team is deciding what's best addressed through rules and guidance. So just a reminder that guidance is another component of this. Ethan,
I agree, but
Yeah.
guidance doesn't
Go
provide
ahead,
any
Ethan.
certainty. It provides best practice.
Yeah, so the safe harbor that you have cited there, 150, is provides that exact sufficiency, clarity for local governments in terms of how much efficiency are we taking when we're deciding between land use efficiency measures, UGB, or a mixture of both.
Then I don't
that
think it's a safe harbor. It's a minimum standard if we're saying that 20% is the threshold that needs to be achieved. What I'm
no,
asking is in terms of legal certainty of a city adopting its housing capacity analysis, how does a city know when it has taken enough land use efficiency measures? Is it only that safe harbor? And if so, then that's a minimum standard. It's not a safe harbor.
no, I would disagree with that. The safe harbor says 20%. If you can achieve 20%, then you're great. Obviously, you do not have to take that 20%. And this is yet another reason why defining land use efficiency measures in the way that it talks to quantifiably reducing the land need is yet another element of allowing that kind of pathway, that clarity for local governments, because they're doing hard math on these land use efficiency measures in a way that, speaks directly to addressing a land need. So
Okay,
the
so unless you've done 20%, you could have, even if you achieve 19%, your HCA or your HPS could be remanded on the grounds that you did not get to that 20 because the department or local stakeholders or whomever wants to see more land use efficiency.
no,
Right. That's what I'm saying, is that there is not a floor threshold here, which the bill, I think, pretty clearly directed to be established. Sorry, I'll stop now. Al has his hand up.
I think sorry, I want to continue going here. So because this is important. The safe harbor provides a benchmark or an opportunity for local governments to say, we've done this and therefore we've done enough, and we're going to move into the next phase of this process, which is, I don't know, choosing other land use efficiency measures beyond 20% or amending a UGB to accommodate their needs. That doesn't preclude a local government from saying, we're going to take somewhat less than 20% and also go through the UGB amendment process. But we know that there's, that's continuing the process that exists currently, where local governments are making the case, they're determining what their need is, how much efficiency to take, and the next step in that process, a UGB amendment. By articulating
doing UGB amendments because they know they're going to be challenged on it because of things like this.
So I think we've
I
heard.
mean, the city of Monmouth this year, right, came into the legislature and said, we have 10 buildable lots in the entire city. And we are trying to do a swap where we're taking 90 acres out of our UGB and saying those won't come back in. And we're bringing 75 acres in. So a net change of negative 15 acres. And they were not comfortable going through the established land use process because they knew it would take too long, it would be too expensive, and there was a high likelihood that they could get challenged on it. And so what I'm asking is there a clear threshold for cities to achieve that is
Thanks,
going
Brock.
to be considered sufficient by the department?
Thanks, Brock.
Yeah, 150 sub 2.
Okay, 20%.
We have less than 20 minutes left for our last two items, so I'm gonna go Al quickly, please, and then back to Jenna and Maddie.
Yeah, real quick, I just would say that my understanding of the 20% is a safe harbor that says you are safe from being challenged under the reasonable capacity requirement of goal 14. And so my sense is that it is intended to be a safe harbor. There is always the risk, that it will be treated by staff or by a court or by opponents as saying you're nowhere near the 20%. And so you're 1% or 5%, which is contextualized because your monmouth is no good. But the fact is, I believe this is, as Ethan says, designed to be a safe harbor from challenge under Goal 14's reasonable capacity requirement.
All right, Jenna and Maddie, let's try to be efficient with our last two items here.
Thanks, Steve. The next topic that you'll see presented both in the memo and in the packet materials is development ready land. Just to remind the group, development ready land has, first of all, the inventory in and of itself is new. So all of the rule language that you'll see here is new. Thanks again for reviewing it after several conversations both at this TAC meeting level, and also those of you who participated in the infrastructure subcommittee, who met several times internally. You'll see new definitions of certain terms: near-term public facilities, readily served, a reference to zone to allow, and the specific terms. The specific term adjacent. You'll also note that, excuse me, you'll also note that there is a robust set of rules related to how a city delineates different types of land, and we've delineated 3 different types of land. The first being those parcels that are readily served and available with the necessary utilities adjacent to them, and or those parcels that will be or are to qualify as development ready because they will be imminently invested in or available to meet those definition standards within the near term. And in response to a conversation that you all had back in July, there's also a third category, which are those properties that may meet the minimum standard, the minimum density requirement of a zone, but perhaps are underserved, pointing out that areas that are not development ready or land that is not development ready might require actions, production strategy actions that could include but are not limited to things like investments in public facility extension, some clarification as to how certain properties might be developed to meet those criteria, including but not limited to annexation and or inclusion in incorporated city limits or particularly zoned to allow for certain housing types. And then thirdly, that there might be clarification required related to resources that could encumber the land. You'll also see a section calculating sufficiency of development ready land. This is particularly important when a city determines, not dissimilar from our previous conversation, how much is enough or how much land is sufficient to meet the development ready land inventory threshold. And the answer is when a city is able to show that they can meet their housing production target, or their housing target rather. That being said, the actions that stem from a development ready land inventory are part of the HPS menu of actions. And you'll see that reflected in a variety of ways as the HPS program and its menu of actions are are rolled out both in this context in rule and in guidance. I will go ahead and open conversation there just to be efficient with our time.
Thanks, Maddie. Does anyone have questions or comments on the development ready land inventory? Let's go, Heather.
I'll just throw these out here. I know we are short on time. So I have some concern about that there's a couple of places where it talks about you have to show that you have to do an analysis that you're unable to support the minimum density or only able to achieve the minimum density. That would require an additional capacity analysis that's different from your buildable lands inventory capacity analysis, which is typically based on the average that you've seen over the past, everything we've just talked about. So that. I don't love that. I wanted to know, and you don't have to answer this now, but whether in A, B, and C, those don't seem mutually exclusive because A and B could also be C, so I wasn't sure if that was the intent. And then I have concerns about 185-2A on whether or not we really need to talk about locations as far as development ready land inventory. Because I was thinking, wouldn't most vacant and partially vacant land, at least in Eugene, we have been developing from the inside out, right? And so most of our vacant and partially vacant land would not be in proximity to the locations as they're defined, transit, community assets, because they haven't developed yet. So those things aren't there. So I just wasn't sure that that was really necessary. And then I'll follow up in an email. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Let's go Damien and then Brock, and then we'll move on to our final item.
Thanks, Steve. I'll be quick. My question refers to 01852, where it refers to a jurisdiction taking housing production actions to remedy a deficiency. And my question is, does this mean a jurisdiction would need to have adopted its housing production strategy before doing its inventory work, or is this something that could be done concurrently with the adoption of the development ready land inventory?
I believe the answer is concurrently.
Thanks. Brock.
Yeah, definition of readily served in the Rule 5 is good, but the definition of adjacent in 1A and Rule 180 seems to be inconsistent with that. If there's facilities 300 feet from the nearest property line of the site, that means that you would have to have 300 feet of connection between, which would be an off-site improvement. So just flagging that.
Thank you, Brock.
Thank you, Brock.
All right, let's move on to our final item, Jenna.
All right, and I'll make it quick because we've talked about this topic before and these concepts aren't new. But the last topic we'll touch on today is how fair housing choice in urbanizable areas is addressed in Division 8. And one of the ways this is addressed is through clearly allowing in rural cities to allow neighborhoods serving commercial and open space on residentially designated land to increase housing choice or fair housing choice. This, I think a previous version previously referred to a definition of complete neighborhoods, but this was removed for this iteration because of its redundancy to existing language in Division 8 related to fair housing choice. And the other key amendment was to add an assessment of areas previously brought into the urban growth boundary in the past 3 housing capacity analysis cycles. And if land has not annexed and been zoned, the guidance will be to direct jurisdictions to specific housing production strategy actions to promote annexation and catalyze development in those areas. For example, annexation agreements, concept and master planning, that sort of thing. So that's really all I have. Again, this isn't new, but there were some language tweaks for clarity and to consolidate rules where possible.
Thank you, Jenna. Questions or comments from the group on this topic? We should have done this one first, Jenna.
Well, I thought, if we cut it short, then that's fine. I think just also, in general, we've talked about all these topics: housing capacity analysis, land use efficiency measures, development ready lands inventory. As you're seeing this all together, are there any, reactions you have? I'll also invite you all again to provide comments via email for those specific language pieces. That's always really helpful.
And I did definitely hear, in our comments today, people thinking about the full spectrum of these changes. So I appreciate, but we definitely wanted to give an opportunity to look at them collectively, I guess, rather than the individually as we've been going through them. Brock?
I do have one on this one. So looking at 100, 1D and I, the last little bit there. So the following components may not be used to determine sufficiency of land for the purpose of amending an urban growth boundary: a comparison of housing capacity and the needed housing locations determined in the contextualized housing need. So as we saw from the Eco Northwest memo, the majority, and I'm pretty sure the vast majority, of affordable rental housing is being developed primarily, even prior to these rules, in areas with high amenities and low harms. One of the other things that we're looking to do through this rules, which were added in the most recent version that was updated, is having the homeownership goal there. What we have seen is that homeownership opportunities tend not to exist in those areas, like central city downtowns. So my question here is whether or not those two are aligned, considering that if we are trying to increase homeownership opportunities for people, and that is a fair housing issue, but right now the only buildable land that we have is in areas where homeownership products are not being developed. And I'm not saying I have a perfect solution here for that yet, but I just want to point out that there is a nexus there.
Thanks, Brock. Definitely something for us to be considering and thinking about as we get nearer and nearer to the finish line here with all the items we talked about today. So some items I think to follow up by email. Your emails are appreciated. I think there was a couple that probably warrant a phone conversation in a little more depth. This group's next meeting is Thursday, September 4th. We are going to be talking about urban growth boundary expansions and exchanges. And then a reminder that the next RAC meeting is next week. I think that's Wednesday, August 27th. And the RAC's going to be talking about UGB amendments in urban reserve areas and then reviewing rulemaking impact statements. So if anyone's interested, please do tune in. Again, thanks. This is hard work, and I recognize that again that you're not always going to see necessarily your comments reflected in the rules, but I assure you that they are being taken seriously and considered. And yeah, it's the fun time, the hard work of getting to the finish line here. So appreciate your continued comments, whether they're new or you're reiterating things that you've shared, perspectives that you've shared in the past. It all helps these rules to be the best version that we can put together. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend and your Labor Day, and we'll see you all in a few weeks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.